Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is part one of a series that we're starting focused on ConfigMgr current branch and the Microsoft Cloud, Azure. Today's session, part one, introduction, just kicking off the series. Here's the agenda. Before we get to the agenda, this series that we're kicking off today really will be a number of presentations that will work through and detail the various ways ConfigMgr can support and interact with Azure, make use of Azure, extend your management, and make use of the various services that are in Azure. Right? The goal of the series as we walk through is to understand those various components in ConfigMgr that can reach out and use data in Azure or use Azure to augment some of the capabilities of ConfigMgr and so on. We'll also talk about how you could use ConfigMgr on-prem or ConfigMgr in the cloud, actually, to manage resources that are on-prem or in Azure, right? So we'll do that as well. Also, a little bit of a not disclaimer really, but an awareness here. So this series will be multiple sessions that, frankly, I've recorded before, but now I'm updating many of them to reflect the changes that have been made in the most recent versions of ConfigMgr, changes that actually are extending these components to make them even better as we go along. There will be a couple of sessions in here in this series that I'm just going to reuse because they're still largely the same and no real reason to go re-record those. So you'll see a couple of sessions in here that are leveraging earlier versions of ConfigMgr. This series is using ConfigMgr 18.10, right, to get through. So just FYI. Okay, so in terms of the agenda, two big umbrella items that we're going to cover in today's session. One is Azure itself. So let's talk through some of the Azure services, some of the Azure concepts. I'll walk you through just really quickly some things in the Azure console that illustrate these things I'll mention. Then we'll turn our attention to the second big umbrella, which is ConfigMgr in Azure, and really talk about why, talk about the options and how things work kind of in that environment, right? And then we'll wrap up for today. Again, nothing too deep today, just trying to get started and introduce the concepts. Okay, so in terms of Azure by itself, services, right? So Azure is the name of the Microsoft Cloud, but Azure contains a whole bunch of different services that can be leveraged by organizations to help meet their business needs, right? So by no means is this an exhaustive list of the services in Azure, right? Just some. And so, for example, Azure Active Directory, big service in Azure, right? In Azure Active Directory, we have things like web pages. We have, by the fact it's Active Directory, identity, right, is in there. Things like conditional access, even setting up application proxy is in Azure Active Directory, and so on. There's other things, being able to configure and use virtual machines, being able to build and define networking and storage to either support your virtual machines or to do other things that you might want to do. Monitoring, being able to set up SQL servers in Azure. And again, there's nuances behind that we won't get into, but it's possible, right? And other databases, depending on what you need, are out there. Security, big concern and something that's definitely out there for Azure. Intune, EMS, Office 365, those are things in the world of manageability that we think of that are definitely services that are provided by Azure and link in with a number of other services in Azure. So Intune is really the only one that we'll talk about in this series. Not that EMS and Office 365 aren't important, but specifically with the cloud node in ConfigMgr, we're talking about the stuff under there. Intune we'll kind of get at again. We'll detail that more as we go along, right? But on and on we could go. Just so many services that are offered by Azure. Okay, so some concepts that are important to understand as we have discussions about Azure. So first, we have to understand that there are deployment models. So Azure deployment, right? So putting things, configuring things in Azure is called an Azure deployment. There are two ways that you can do Azure deployments. One is called the classic deployment model, and the other is called the ARM, or Azure Resource Manager deployment model, right? So the classic deployment model, this was actually the original Azure deployment model, the only one whenever Azure first rolled out. This deployment model initially was also the one that was used by config manager components, such as the Cloud Management Gateway, the Cloud Distribution Point, right? In this model, each resource basically would exist independently. No real way to group related resources together. Instead, you owned manually tracking resources. If you needed to update something for your solution, you needed to remember yourself to manage various pieces in a coordinated way, right? So that was the first deployment model. Then came what we call, again, Azure Resource Manager deployment, ARM deployment. This is the preferred method now for deployment. So this was added and gave us the concept of what we call a resource group. A resource group basically is a container for all the resources that might share a common life cycle, right? The Resource Manager deployment model provides a few benefits, such as being able to deploy, manage, and monitor all the services for your solution as a unit, as a group, instead of having to handle these services individually. You can also repeatedly deploy your solution throughout its lifecycle. Have confidence that as your resources are deployed, it'll be in a consistent state, right? You can apply access control across all the resources in a given resource group. And then policies are automatically applied if you add different items to the resource group. You can apply tags. You can represent your resource group in terms of a JSON file, right? You can define dependencies between resources as they're deployed so that they get deployed in the right order, right? And Config Manager, the components I mentioned, the Cloud Distribution Point, the Cloud Management Gateway, have been updated to support this ARM-based deployment model. So right now in 18.10, you can choose Classic and ARM as you go through with these pieces, as you'll see as we go along, right? But ARM, Azure Resource Manager, is the preferred way to do deployments, right? So, okay, so I was going to go on a tangent, but I will stay here and go on that tangent a bit later. So a few more concepts. Resource groups. So what are they? Resource groups provide a way to monitor, control access, provision, manage billing for groups of assets that are required to run a given application, right? And there's other ways that you can envision using a resource group. I kind of think of a resource group as a sandbox in Azure. And in that sandbox, I'm going to put all the different components that I need to run together and have visibility to each other. And yeah, there's ways to connect resource groups, right? A lot of advanced things you can do. But that's kind of the way I think about resource groups. More on that in just a minute. Then you also have subscriptions, right? So an Azure subscription basically is going to grant you access to the Azure service. It's also going to give you access to the Azure Management Portal, right? Really two big uses of subscriptions. So the Azure account, the subscription is really for billing. So the subscription is essentially an Azure mechanism through which resource usage is reported and services are billed. Now there's another aspect to it as well. The subscription itself, which governs access to and use of the Azure services that is subscribed to, and then the subscription holder manages the services such as Azure, SQL, storage accounts, and so on as they move through the Azure portal, right? Okay. A virtual machine. So this is a concept, and certainly we can do that in Azure, build VMs in Azure. So an Azure virtual machine, just like a virtual machine running in any other fabric, except it's running in Azure, right? VMs, associated storage, are examples of objects that are created and need to be assigned to resource groups. Then finally, security resources in Azure, just as important as securing resources on-prem. Like on-prem, there are many ways to implement security, including identity, certs, web apps, more on we go, right? Again, not an attempt to detail all these things in Azure, but just to introduce you to some concepts. And that's the purpose of this graphic as well. So here is my section, Tailspin Toys, in Azure, right? And then you'll have other organizations that have their own sections and unique structures in Azure. So this is my Azure tenant, Tailspin Toys, right? Inside my Azure tenant, there's a number of different things that I might want to configure. I have Azure Active Directory. I might have a resource group that will contain virtual machines, virtual networks, storage, on and on and on. I can have a second resource group that contains other unique entities. I can have a third resource group that contains additional entities, right? I have Microsoft Store for Business, maybe, that I have configured and provisioned for my tenant. I have, what used to be called OMS, Operations Management Suite, now called, now split into its own components, but I represent it here just for convenience. I may have created a link in for that, right? And so many things that I can do whenever I have my own space in Azure. Then I have the subscriptions that will allow me to uniquely decide what users or what entities, what subscriptions can be tied to which pieces inside my Azure tenant for billing, and on we go, right? So visual representation of some of these concepts, right? Okay, so that said, let's just briefly, and I do mean briefly, walk through Azure. And so here's the Azure portal, and you see these things like resource groups. You see them here, right? And we talked about resource groups are the sandbox in Azure that will contain. So I have several sandboxes in Azure that I've configured, right? Then we can go down and see all the different other services. We see virtual machines here, two different ways, classic and then the updated one. We can view our subscriptions here, right? We can go through and look at your cost and get help and do monitoring, and then there's so many other services. If you want to look at all of the services that are available in Azure, you can literally browse all of, there's so many, right, that are available to you. No way to try to talk about all of them, and that's not the point of this discussion anyway. But this is just a quick look at Azure. You can build your own personal dashboard if you want, right, on how you visualize things, and that's mine that's starting to load, but I'll go ahead and take it away now. And that very quick demo, just quickly to show you about how things look in Azure. And we'll be back to the Azure console as we go through some of the additional sessions coming up. Okay, now, Config Manager in Azure. Why do we care, right? So when we think about Config Manager in Azure, there are a number of things, right? So first of all, cloud capabilities that are out there in Azure, we can tap into them with Config Manager. Essentially, we can extend our Config Manager functionality to the cloud, right? One thing that's really awesome about the cloud, frequent updates, new capabilities coming all the time. It's a cloud-first mentality is where we are at Microsoft, and building things into the cloud will get them in your hands faster, right? Let you take advantage of them faster, benefit your business faster. So cloud first is the idea and the way forward. Rapid Config Manager cadence fits perfectly with enabling relevant cloud services. So with our updated approach to how we service Config Manager, updating it every 4 months, keeps pace really nicely with the cloud features that come, and we can plug in and add things really nicely, with that cadence. Basically, the combination of Config Manager and Azure gives you the ultimate flexibility, gives you the ability to make the best choice to fit your needs, right? Again, you could decide to build and manage Config Manager on-prem, right? And just manage your clients on-prem if that works for you, and still be able to take advantage of some of the cloud services that we'll detail in the session. You can build everything for Config Manager and management in Azure and just keep it there, or you can do a hybrid where you have some components in Azure, some components on-prem, and on we go, right? So great flexibility. The thought also is, many organizations will have virtual machines in Azure. Well, those virtual machines need to be managed as well, and so being able to have Config Manager support Azure be able to reach out and manage those machines is just a good thing, right? Just a good thing. Okay, so some of the services that are offered, we'll see those in just a minute, more so, but some of the services that are offered would be things like log analytics integration, device health attestation integration, being able to do upgrade analytics, cloud management gateway, cloud distribution point, on we go. And the beauty of these things is there's really, in some cases, no to minimal configuration required. Some of them, depending on what it is, will require maybe more understanding, more configuration, but the beauty of having this integration in ConfigMgr is ConfigMgr can do a lot of the work for you when setting up these components, and that will come clear as we go along, right? Really depends on the service, as I mentioned, but certainly it's out there. Again, flexibility, being able to do cloud only, on-prem only, hybrid environments, as I mentioned a moment ago, and then innovation. Right? Again, with the cloud-first direction, we are constantly adding things to Azure, constantly updating Azure. The Azure's where we have the most frequent updates going on to add new functionality, right? Again, with the release cadence of ConfigMgr being every 4 months, we keep pace really, really well. And the release cadence of ConfigMgr is also really nice because we can get customer feedback through telemetry and so on very quickly and rapidly respond to any issues that we see. So that's really nice, right? And then finally, scale. You can scale with Azure globally. You can scale in a dynamic way where you add right, for certain seasonality kind of demands and so on, and then retract that whenever you don't need it anymore and so on. Proven, scale in Azure, no question about it. If you need it, we can add it, and we can support you with it, and so on, right? And so in terms of ConfigMgr, you think, well, what scale? ConfigMgr is where I get my scale, right? Well, yeah, but Azure gives you, linked in with ConfigMgr, the ability to scale as well. I'll give you one example of a couple. So the Cloud Management Gateway. It has the ability in itself to have anywhere between 1 and 16 virtual machines. Don't worry about that now. We'll get to that in a session later. But even there, if you need more than the 16 VMs that the Cloud Management Gateway provides, you can just add another Cloud Management Gateway. And so there's lots of ways that you can do things and meet the scale that you need to push for your business. Okay. And then specifically focusing on ConfigMgr and Azure in terms of options. So I've laid out several of these different things or several different intersections between ConfigMgr and Azure that you will see as we go through these episodes in the series, if you will, right? So the first one, log analytics. This was formerly known as the Operations Management Suite integration. OMS still exists. It's just been redistributed. The different features there have been redistributed across Azure. Don't get bogged on there, but you can absolutely configure ConfigMgr to link in with log analytics. We'll talk about that. Being able to leverage Azure or on-prem, but leverage Azure to handle maintaining the health of your device. ConfigMgr can consume that data, show it to you, you can use it in ConfigMgr. Same thing with upgrade readiness. Being able to know that you're ready to do an upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10, or even versions of Windows 10 to another version of Windows 10. The Microsoft Store for Business, where you can manage and acquire and deploy store apps, right? What would be considered modern apps, kind of thing, right? We can integrate with that. We can help you be able to deploy those different things. The cloud distribution point, where we can put content out in Azure that devices that are remote to your organization can reach out to, can get it, right? That paired with the Cloud Management Gateway, right? Can really shine in terms of letting you manage your remote systems. Conditional access is another one, ensuring connected systems meet corporate security requirements. Now, we're not going to talk about conditional access in this series. Again, we're going to be focused on what's under the cloud management node, and conditional access isn't, so we're not going to talk about that here. Co-management, another one, where we can manage with both ConfigMgr and Intune Windows 10 devices, right? Give the best of both worlds give the most flexibility in terms of management options. Autopilot. So autopilot's one that's interestingly not does not specifically reference Config Manager as being required for autopilot. It's not. But autopilot's really cool, and you can integrate it with Config Manager so you work better together, set up that co-management scenario, and so on. There's other things that we don't list here that we'll talk about, and certainly as we go along, other things are being added, right? That's why you see more. And so one of those examples, if you look at the technical preview, again, I'm recording this on 1810. So the technical preview out right now is including a feature called Desktop Analytics. It's coming. That will be added to this list as we go forward, and there will be a session on that we'll do later on. And we'll just keep innovating, right, as we go along. So lots and lots and lots of options as to ways you can integrate Config Manager with Azure, benefit your environment, and so on. Okay, so still on the Config Manager and Azure options, right? Just an attempt to illustrate that with Config Manager, you have the best capabilities that you'd want. You can do whatever you want, right? So the first graphic, if you want to put Config Manager and manage resources only in Azure, called Cloud Only, you can do that. I work with a customer that is only using cloud-based resources. They don't have anything, on-prem. Maybe some workstations here and there, but largely their infrastructure is in the cloud. So that would fit for them, being able to put Config Manager in Azure, manage the resources in Azure, right? You can also manage the resources that are not in Azure. So there's two ways to do that. One called the hybrid cloud, both called the hybrid cloud, but here Config Manager might live in Azure, and the managed resources might just be on-prem, right? Might have some managed resources up here too, that's fine, where Config Manager is, but the idea is stage Config Manager in Azure, manage your resources on-prem wherever they are, works great, right? Same kind of thing if you put Config Manager on-prem and you want to manage on-prem resources and then also stretch out to manage resources that are in Azure. That works great too, right? So the options, the flexibility, it's up to you, whatever you need, right? And we will have a session on this as we go forward in the series. Okay. So Config Manager in Azure in terms of resource access. This is where I've seen some people kind of get tripped up a little bit and trying to understand how it all works. So there's really three ways that Config Manager will allow access or need access, interact with Azure, that kind of thing. The first, one of the most pervasive ones is by using a web application created in Azure. Not going to talk about the details of that right now, but you'll see it as we go forward. So you will see that Config Manager leverages web applications in Azure to support connectivity with these different pieces in the cloud column in Config Manager. There's also certain pieces, Cloud Distribution Point Classic and Cloud Management Gateway Classic, that will leverage certificates to support communication between on-prem and Azure, and on we go, right? So we'll see that. And then there's Log Analytics and Upgrade Readiness will use the Microsoft Monitoring Agent installed on Config Manager to communicate back and forth with certain components in Azure. Again, you'll see all of these as we set them up. Okay, last thing that I'm going to take you on a quick tour of Azure, of Config Manager and the capabilities in Azure is this thing, right? User discovery. So one of the really important things in Azure is being able to factor in user accounts that your organization may have synchronized to Azure, letting Azure be leveraged as an identity service in cases, right? Again, we'll talk about that more for where it applies and so on. There's a place that you go to in Config Manager called Cloud Management, where you can go set up interactions and so on with your Azure Active Directory, right? So very simply, and I'll show this to you in just a minute, you will go through and you will configure the applications, the web applications that you want to use to connect with Config Manager. Mentioned on the previous slide that web apps is one of the ways that we can allow Config Manager a hook into Azure, an authenticated way to do various tasks that Config Manager is configured to do, right? So what's interesting about this page is where you configure the web apps. Now, certain components after you configure the web apps will use those web apps, specifically the Config Manager, the Cloud Management Gateway and the Cloud Distribution Point. In 1810, there are certain components that will require you to create unique web applications, right? So there's some discussion about which one is better, right? I really like the idea of having unique web applications for every single service that Config Manager provides. You don't have to do it that way. It's convenient not to do it that way, but in the mindset of least privilege kind of deal, having a separate one makes sense so that you can have that web app uniquely do the function of whatever component. Again, getting way off of the weeds right now. Suffice it to say, here's where you can allow Config Manager to build the web apps for you, right? And you'll see that node in just a minute, right? We won't really configure any web apps there. I will save that for later, but whenever we get to the components that really can leverage that. But for now, this is where you would do it. Then on the next page under Discovery, you can tell Config Manager to enable discovery of Active Directory users, Azure Active Directory users. Now, you don't have to. In fact, in my lab, whenever we get to it, you will see me set up 2 connections into Azure Active Directory. It's just something I have to do because of the way we at Microsoft do different things, right? And it might be useful for you to know how to do it too. So we'll get through that here in a minute, right? So anyway, just an attempt to show you how this all works. Ultimately, this configuration allows the site server to talk all the way through to Azure Active Directory and get the information that's needed and so forth, right? Okay. So all that said, let me show you what this all looks like in Config Manager. Again, a very short demo, nothing real long here, but this is my Config Manager console. So if I go to Administration, here's the Cloud Services node I keep referencing. And here are the various ways in which Config Manager in 1810 can connect with and leverage Azure. So here's co-management. We'll talk about that. Here's Azure Services. Azure Services actually has a number of different places that we can integrate. So what's still called the OMS connector, this is the Log Analytics connector. I expect that to be updated as we go forward. Upgrade Readiness connector, Store for Business connector. You'll see me configure those in later sessions. Then we have the ability to configure Azure Active Directory tenants. So this is where I would go through and you would see the Azure AD tenants. So if I wanted to really configure those, now I would go through and I would configure the cloud management piece, right? And then the Azure Active Directory tenants would show up there. Okay, I may come back to this and configure those in just a minute. Not sure, I haven't decided. I'm thinking about it as we go through. Here is where you would be able to configure the Cloud Distribution Point, Cloud Management Gateway. Here's Intune subscriptions. Now this is still here in 1810. Be aware that what this is basically what we used to call Config Manager Intune hybrid configuration, right? I won't detail that, but suffice it to say, Config Manager Intune hybrid is a deprecated capability. The way to do it now is through what we call co-management. We'll talk about that in one of our sessions. But this is the area that we're talking about in terms of what we're going to focus on in this series and how we can link in pretty easily with Azure. Okay, I will show you how to create the Azure service. So I'll just do it real quick here. You'll see whenever I get into my demos, I'll actually have 2 just because of the way that we have our things configured here at Microsoft. But for now, I'll just create 1. And so I'll call this Cloud Service or Cloud Management and Tailscope Toys. Okay, good enough. And so move forward. And so here is where I can choose the Azure Public Cloud, Azure Government Cloud, whichever you're using. And then here is where I'm being asked for 2 web apps, a server web app and a client web app. So again, web apps are used for authentication purposes. So I will leverage ConfigMgr's ability to go ahead and create the web app for me. So notice, now I can create the web app. Actually, you'll see me create the web app in Azure in some of the sections coming up. Or I can use this to create the web app for me. And then certain services can use that web app that I've created, specifically Cloud Management Gateway and I believe Cloud Management Cloud Distribution Point. But I'm going to go ahead and just, for ease, create it here. So the way I do that, I can just call it, I like to call it ConfigMgr svc -Steve Rack -tailspin toys. And the name, just whatever you want. The URLs don't matter here. This is literally just to give ConfigMgr a place to hook in and do different things. So I'm going to say just 2 years, and then you sign in to your Azure tenant. So in this case, I'm going to sign in to mine. Good enough. And click next. And then good enough, next. And so we go try to sign into Azure, and notice signed in successfully. So here is my Azure AD tenant name. I hit OK. So now I have this one. I can just say, hey, okay, use that one. And then I go do the same thing over here. So I'm going to create this. And using the same, I already forgot the naming context. One moment. ConfigMgr Steve Rack, okay, Tailspin Toys, that's fine. So let's do that again. Create. Type in the box, Steve. Client dash Steve Rack Tailspin Toys. Same deal. Just going to give it the URL here. And sign in one more time. All right. And we should get a successful sign in, and we are created again. And so I'm going to select that one, hit OK, and next. Now, here we get the choice. Do we want to be able to discover users out of Azure Active Directory? In my case, Tailspin Toys is where I'm synchronizing my users, and so I want to allow that. So I'm going to go ahead and click next, and finish, right? So now I've got that done. Now, what happened as a result of that? Well, first of all, you see that indeed Azure Active Directory is configured here, right? And then you have your Azure Active Directory tenants that have been created. So here are your application names that have been created, the 2 web apps that were created. So this wasn't accessible. You really can't do anything in here to create anything. I could go in and delete this if I wanted to. I cannot go in and delete these web apps down here. So one note, in 1810, if you go to create the web app, and you make a mistake or you want to change it or whatever else, there's no way in the console right now to delete web apps that you have created, right? You can do that all day in Azure, but if you want to then try to reuse the name and so on, it can get a little bit interesting. There are ways to get rid of them. I just say it for 1810, you can't. You could delete this whole Azure AD tenant, and that would remove these. But oftentimes you don't want to do that. You just want to remove one of them. And there are ways to do it. And I anticipate that things will be easier where you can individually select web apps that you can delete. Right? But this is how it's referenced. So right now, if I am in Azure Services, again, here's my cloud. I can actually go and trigger running discovery against Azure AD right now. So I'll go trigger that. Right? And so what that's going to do is go scan Azure AD, find all the users that are synchronized out there, and then try to pull them in. Okay, one additional thing I said I wasn't going to get too deep in this session. I am only going deep in terms of this, but let me show you how you would actually troubleshoot whether that synchronization is working or not. Let me find that log right here. Here's the Azure AD Discovery Agent. If I look in the log, it will tell me whether that synchronization has worked, and it did. Found 18 total users and created those, and so the sync completed. So this is where the discovery actually happens. Once you have a successful discovery, then you can go in and look at your users that are synchronized in right here, right? And so that's kind of how it works. Again, didn't want to get off all in the weeds on that, but this was a chance to show you that, right? Again, so whenever you see me go forward, you will see another cloud management piece here, again, to hook into another tenant that I need to be able to do what I'm going to do in future sessions. But that's enough for now, and for your environment, you won't have to do probably two. Either way, right? So that's what I wanted to walk through and show you. Let me pull the lab out, right? And that also is going to wrap up our introduction session. And from here, we'll start to build in and illustrate how we work with all of the different components of Azure, how we create them, interact with Azure, what they look like when they're working, and so on. So we will wrap it here, and we will see you next time.